Picture this: Grace Hamilton's grandmother's 1940 Hermes scarf, worth $12,000, and the only thing connecting her to a family line of strong women sliced to ribbons by a teenage sociopath with daddy issues and a utility knife. But here's what Preston Blackwood didn't know. Grace Hamilton remembers everything. Every slight, every injustice, every bully who ever thought quiet meant weak. And she was about to teach Elmwood Preparatory School's golden boy that some teachers don't just educate, they execute justice. You know what they say about quiet people? When they finally snap, the whole world listens, and trust me, you'll want to hear every word of this. The morning mist clung to Elmwood Preparatory's Gothic spires like secrets refusing to surface, and Grace Hamilton stood at her classroom window, watching 17-year-old Preston Blackwood stride across the courtyard with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. At 8:15 a.m., the Massachusetts autumn painted everything in shades of amber and rust, but Preston moved through it like he owned the very air. Grace's fingers traced the edge of her grandmother's silk scarf, rose-colored threads that had witnessed a young French woman's courage during Nazi occupation, had crossed the Atlantic hidden in a refugee's suitcase, had survived because someone refused to stay silent. Today, draped around Grace's neck like armor against a hostile world, it felt heavier than usual. Some mornings, Grace whispered to herself, you can smell the storm coming. At 28, Grace Hamilton had learned to read the ecosystem of cruelty that thrived in places like Elmwood, where legacy trumped merit, where silence bought safety, and where teachers like her first-generation college graduates on scholarship backgrounds walked a tightrope between respect and rebellion. Her classroom was her sanctuary, filled with worn copies of Steinbeck and Morrison, walls lined with quotes about justice and courage. A place where literature met life and sometimes, if she was lucky, changed it. But Preston Blackwood represented everything wrong with this marble and mahogany world. Fourth-generation Elmwood legacy. His great-grandfather's portrait hung in the main hall. His father, Richard, sat on the board of trustees, and his mother's tragic accident 12 years ago had bought him a lifetime of sympathy and immunity. The golden boy quarterback with surgical smile and dead eyes, who destroyed people for sport and called it character building. Grace had watched him operate for 3 years now. The way he'd systematically dismantled Autumn Reeves after she'd rejected his advances, spreading her private photos through encrypted group chats. How he'd sabotaged Sawyer Mills's scholarship application by planting plagiarized content in his essays. The calculated cruelties disguised as pranks, the institutional blindness that protected him, the silence money could buy, but today felt different. Today, Preston's ice-blue stare lingered too long on Grace's scarf during first-period advanced literature, his fingers drumming against his lacrosse stick with predatory rhythm. When she'd assigned Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, he'd raised his hand with theatrical politeness. "Miss Hamilton." Preston's voice carried that particular prep school drawl that made every word sound like condescension. Don't you think Lenny's problem was that nobody ever taught him consequences? Sometimes destruction is the only language certain people understand. The classroom went silent, 23 other students suddenly finding their textbooks fascinating. Grace recognized the challenge Preston testing boundaries, probing for weakness, establishing dominance through intellectual intimidation. Interesting perspective. Preston, Grace replied, her voice steady as winter morning. Though I'd argue Lenny's tragedy wasn't lack of consequences, it was lack of protection from those who should have cared for him. Sometimes the real monsters wear the nicest clothes. Their eyes locked across the classroom, a moment of electric tension where masks almost slipped. Preston's smile tightened, just barely. But Grace caught it. She'd drawn blood. "Of course," Preston said, leaning back with practiced nonchalance. "Everyone's entitled to their interpretation, though some interpretations matter more than others." After class, as students filed out in their usual hierarchies, legacy kids first. Scholarship students, carefully invisible, Grace noticed Preston lingering. He approached her desk with the languid confidence of someone accustomed to having doors opened before he knocked. "Beautiful scarf," he said, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. Vintage, Grace's hand moved instinctively to the silk at her throat. "Family heirloom. How precious!" Preston's eyes held something that made Grace's skin crawl. "You know, Miss Hamilton, heirlooms are fragile things. One wrong move and poof, generations of history. Gone forever. It would be such a shame if something happened to something so irreplaceable." He left without another word, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. By 10:30 a.m., the morning's unease had crystallized into genuine dread. Grace sat in the faculty lounge during her prep period, trying to focus on lesson plans while her colleagues whispered about the latest Preston situation, apparently. He'd been caught with another student's medication, claiming he was helping them manage their dosage. The conversation died when Dr. Helena Cross entered, the headmistress's silver hair perfectly coiffed. Her expression carefully neutral. "Grace, Doctor." Cross's voice carried years of practiced diplomacy. "Might I have a word?" They walked to Dr. Cross's office, past portraits of distinguished alumni, through hallways that reeked of privilege and tradition. The headmistress closed the door with deliberate care. "I understand there was some tension in your literature class this morning." Grace studied the woman who'd run Elmwood for 15 years, whose nervous tick touching her pearl necklace betrayed anxiety beneath administrative composure. Preston made some concerning comments about consequences and destruction. "I found them inappropriate, given recent events." Preston has been through tremendous trauma. Dr. Cross's fingers found her pearls. "Losing his mother so young, we must show compassion for our students' emotional journeys." "And what about compassion for his victims?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Dr. Cross's mask slipped, revealing something harder underneath. "Grace, you're a talented educator, but you're also young. You don't understand the complexities of running an institution like this. Preston's family has been extraordinarily generous to Elmwood. Sometimes we must balance individual concerns with the greater good." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. The greater good, is that what we called it when Autumn Reeves tried to transfer schools, when Sawyer Mills lost his scholarship, when— Enough. Dr. Cross's voice cut like winter wind. "I'm giving you advice, as someone who cares about your future here. Preston graduates in 7 months. Keep your head down. Focus on teaching. And don't create problems that don't need to exist." Grace left the office feeling like she'd been branded, marked as troublemaker, flagged as threat to the carefully maintained order. But as she walked back toward her classroom, she passed the trophy case where Preston's achievements gleamed behind polished glass, and she made a decision that would change everything. Some fights choose you. Lunchtime brought false normalcy. Students scattered across Elmwood's manicured campus, segregated by invisible but ironclad social boundaries. Grace usually ate in her classroom, grading papers while nibbling a sandwich. But today, she needed air. She walked the perimeter path that circled the grounds, her grandmother's scarf trailing in the October breeze. That's when she spotted them, huddled near the groundskeeper's shed like conspirators planning revolution. Knox Sterling Preston's supposed best friend and faithful lieutenant whispering urgently to Autumn Reeves. Grace's breath caught. This was unprecedented. Knox and Autumn occupied different worlds in Elmwood's rigid ecosystem. Grace ducked behind the chapel's stone wall, close enough to hear fragments of conversation. "Can't keep protecting him." Knox's voice, usually confident, trembled with something like desperation. "You've been recording." Autumn's whisper carried disbelief and hope in equal measure. "Everything. For months. Ever since—" Knox's voice cracked. "Ever since what he did to my sister." Grace's mind raced. Knox had a sister. She'd never heard him mention family. But then again, scholarship students like Knox learned early to keep personal lives separate from school personas. "Why now?" Autumn asked. Knox was quiet for a long moment. "Because Miss Hamilton looked him in the eye today. Really looked. And I saw something I haven't seen before." "What?" "Someone who won't back down." Grace pressed closer to the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. "He's planning something," Knox continued. "Something big. He's been talking about teaching someone a lesson about respect, about showing the whole school what happens when you challenge the natural order." "Who?" "Miss Hamilton. He's obsessed with her scarf. Keeps talking about family heirlooms and how fragile beautiful things can be. I think," Knox's voice dropped to barely audible, "I think he's going to destroy it. Publicly. During the assembly tomorrow." Grace felt the world tilt, her grandmother's scarf suddenly feeling like a target painted on her chest. But beneath the fear came something else, something molten and dangerous. Rage. The afternoon dissolved into a haze of forced normalcy, Grace teaching her remaining classes with mechanical precision, while her mind churned through possibilities. She couldn't report Knox's conversation. It would expose him as a potential ally and eliminate any chance of gathering evidence. She couldn't avoid the assembly attendance was mandatory for all faculty, which left her with one option: meet Preston's attack head-on at 3:45 p.m. as students flooded toward buses and luxury cars. Grace remained in her classroom. She pulled out her phone and began making calls to former colleagues, to contacts in education advocacy, to people who'd offered help she'd never thought she'd need. The first call went to Alexandra Chen, a civil rights attorney who'd spoken at Elmwood last year about educational equity. They'd connected over shared experiences as first-generation college graduates navigating elite institutions. "Grace Hamilton," Alexandra's voice carried warmth and steel in equal measure. "I was wondering when you'd call." "You've been expecting my call." "Honey, I've been watching Elmwood for years. Places like that don't change from the inside, they have to be forced to evolve. Tell me everything." Grace talked for 47 minutes, laying out 3 years of documented incidents, administrative cover-ups, and institutional enabling. Alexandra listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or specific details. "You realize what you're describing isn't just bullying," Alexandra said finally. "It's systematic harassment enabled by institutional corruption. This is a federal case waiting to happen. What would I need to prove it? Evidence, documentation, witnesses willing to testify. And one more thing, a catalyst. Something so egregious, so public, that even money can't cover it up." Grace touched her scarf, silk warm against her fingertips. "I think I know what that might be." Her second call went to Marcus Webb, an investigative journalist who'd been trying to crack the private school corruption story for years. The third to Dr. Sarah Kim, a trauma psychologist who specialized in institutional abuse. By 5:15 p.m., Grace had assembled what she privately called her Justice Network professionals who understood that sometimes individual courage needed institutional support to create lasting change. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Tomorrow, you learn what happens to teachers who forget their place. Sweet dreams. Grace screenshot the message, adding it to a growing digital file that would soon see daylight in ways Preston Blackwood never imagined. That evening, Grace sat in her small apartment overlooking Maple Ridge's town center. Her grandmother's scarf spread across her dining table like a battle map. She'd inherited more than silk and thread, she'd inherited stories. Stories of women who'd faced down Nazis, who'd smuggled Jewish children to safety, who'd documented atrocities when the world preferred blindness. Her phone rang at 8:30 p.m., Knox Sterling's name appearing on the screen. Grace hesitated. Accepting meant crossing a line from which there was no return. "Miss Hamilton," Knox's voice sounded younger than his 17 years. "Knox, are you safe to talk? I'm in my dorm room. Preston's at lacrosse practice." A pause. "I heard him on the phone with his father tonight. They're planning something for tomorrow's assembly. Something about teaching lessons and showing the whole school how things really work." Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "Knox, why are you telling me this?" The silence stretched so long Grace thought he'd hung up. When Knox finally spoke, his voice cracked with emotion. "Because 3 years ago, my sister Emma was a student here. She was smart, funny, kind, everything good about this place, and Preston destroyed her. Systematically, methodically. The administration blamed her for social difficulties and suggested she'd be happier elsewhere." Grace felt ice form in her veins. "What happened to her?" "She's in a treatment facility in Vermont for eating disorders and self-harm. She hasn't spoken Preston's name in 2 years without having panic attacks." Knox's breathing became ragged. "I stayed quiet because I was a coward. Because I needed my scholarship. Because I told myself one person couldn't make a difference. And no, now I've been recording everything for 8 months. Every cruel joke, every planning session, every moment of administrative cowardice. I have hours of evidence on encrypted drives hidden in 3 different locations." Grace's heart raced. "Knox, that's incredibly dangerous." "So is staying silent." His voice hardened with resolve. "Miss Hamilton, I know what's going to happen tomorrow. Preston's going to destroy your scarf in front of the entire school. He's going to humiliate you so completely that no teacher here will ever challenge the established order again." "How do you know?" "Because I helped him plan it. Because I'm supposed to film it. Because until today, I was just another coward hiding behind my scholarship." The weight of the moment settled between them. 2 people standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing that stepping forward meant war. "What do you need from me?" Grace asked. "Trust and courage. Because tomorrow, we're going to give Preston Blackwood exactly what he deserves, the truth." Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that October mornings in Massachusetts are famous for, and Grace Hamilton stood before her bedroom mirror at 6:20 a.m., wrapping her grandmother's scarf around her neck for what might be the last time. The rose-colored silk felt different today, heavier with history, lighter with purpose. She'd spent the night preparing, not lesson plans or grading, but evidence. Photographs of documented incidents, screenshots of social media harassment, recorded conversations with former students who'd finally agreed to speak on record. Her apartment looked like a war room, papers scattered across every surface. her laptop glowing with open browser tabs and encrypted files. At 7:15 a.m., Grace's phone buzzed with a message from Knox position confirmed. Cameras ready. Are you? She typed back. Born ready. The All Souls Assembly was scheduled for 10 a.m. in Elmwood's historic auditorium, a mandatory gathering where students, faculty, and select parents would commemorate deceased community members. This year's theme was Legacy and Remembrance, fitting, given what Grace planned to reveal about certain legacies built on silence and suffering. Grace arrived at school earlier than usual, using her key to enter the building while security was light. She needed access to Dr. Cross's office specifically, to the filing cabinets that contained incident reports dating back 5 years. What she found made her stomach turn. Dozens of complaints against Preston and his circle, each one marked Resolved, No Action Needed, or Student Counseled, Matter Closed. But it was the sealed file marked Blackwood, Monica, Confidential, that changed everything. Preston's mother hadn't died in a tragic accident. She'd died by suicide, drowning in the school's Olympic-sized pool after leaving a note detailing years of her son's increasingly violent behavior and her husband's threats to commit her if she sought help. The school had covered it up, claiming accidental drowning, sealing records, and ensuring the family's continued financial support through grief counseling and memorial donations. Grace photographed every page, her hands shaking with rage and revelation. At 8:45 a.m., students began filtering into the auditorium, their usual segregated seating patterns invisible to adult eyes but rigid as law to adolescent minds. Preston held court in the front section reserved for seniors, his blonde hair catching morning light streaming through stained glass windows, his perfect smile hiding secrets that would soon see daylight. Grace took her assigned seat in the faculty section, Cross beside her, nervously fingering pearl necklace. The headmistress's eyes kept darting to Grace's scarf, as if she sensed the coming storm. Lovely assembly weather, Dr. Cross murmured, small talk that felt like diplomacy between enemy nations. Perfect for revelations, Grace replied, watching Preston's profile as he laughed at something Knox whispered in his ear. The irony wasn't lost on her. Knox playing his role to perfection, maintaining cover until the crucial moment. In his blazer pocket, a camera the size of a button recorded everything, building evidence that would soon explode across social media and national news. At 9:55 a.m., Dr. Cross approached the podium, tapping the microphone with practiced efficiency. The auditorium fell silent, 500 souls gathering to honor the dead. Unaware, they were about to witness the death of an institution's carefully maintained lies. Welcome to our annual All Souls Assembly, Dr. Cross began, her voice carrying across the hushed space. Today we remember those who've shaped our community's legacy. Grace's hand moved to her scarf, silk warm against her palm. In 10 minutes, Preston would make his move, attempting to destroy not just fabric and thread, but the very idea that teachers like Grace could challenge systems like Elmwood. He was about to learn that some legacies are worth fighting for, and some fights, once started, never end. The moment came at exactly 10:07 a.m. Preston Blackwood rose from his seat with the fluid grace of a predator who'd been circling his prey for weeks, and Grace Hamilton felt every nerve in her body sing with electric anticipation. This was it, the catalyst Alexandra Chen had spoken of. The public moment so egregious that even Elmwood's money couldn't cover it up. Dr. Cross had just finished introducing the memorial slideshow when Preston's voice cut through the reverent silence, clear and commanding. trained by years of expectation that the world would stop and listen. "Dr. Cross, if I may interrupt," Preston said, his smile bright enough to blind. "I'd like to share something about legacy and remembrance that I think everyone needs to hear." The headmistress froze at the podium, her fingers finding those pearls again, sensing danger but powerless to prevent it. Preston was already moving toward the front of the auditorium, his lacrosse team flanking him like an honor guard. Knox Sterling following with dutiful loyalty that masked revolutionary intent. "Legacy," Preston continued, his voice projecting to the back rows where parents sat in expensive suits and designer dresses, "isn't just about what we inherit, it's about what we protect. Sometimes that protection requires difficult lessons." Grace remained motionless in her faculty seat, every instinct screaming flight, while her grandmother's courage demanded fight. Around her, teachers shifted uncomfortably, sensing the electric tension that preceded storms. Preston's ice-blue eyes found Grace's across the auditorium, and his smile sharpened into something that belonged in nightmares. "Miss Hamilton," he called out, his voice carrying false respect that fooled no one. "Would you mind joining me up here? I think there's something everyone should see." The auditorium held its breath, 500 people watching a drama unfold that they didn't yet understand. Grace stood slowly, her movements deliberate as winter morning, the rose-colored scarf at her throat catching light like armor. She walked toward Preston with measured steps, knowing she was walking into an ambush, knowing that what happened next would define not just her career, but the soul of Elmwood itself. "Beautiful scarf," Preston said when she reached the front, his voice now amplified by the sound system, his words carrying to every corner of the space. "Family heirloom, if I remember correctly." "My grandmother's," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She wore it while documenting Nazi atrocities in occupied France. Preston's smile widened, predatory and perfect. How fascinating, and how fragile such old things can be. That's when he pulled out the utility knife. The collective gasp from the audience was like oxygen being sucked from the room, and for a moment, that lasted eternity. Everyone understood exactly what was about to happen. Dr. Cross started forward from the podium, then stopped, paralyzed by the implications of intervening. "You see," Preston said, addressing the auditorium while his eyes never left Grace's face. "Sometimes precious things become burdens. Sometimes they need to be liberated." The blade flicked open with surgical precision, chrome catching auditorium lights like lightning. Knox Sterling's hidden camera recorded every second, every micro-expression of anticipated cruelty on Preston's face, every moment of institutional cowardice as faculty members sat frozen in their seats. This was the evidence that would destroy everything, not just Preston's reputation, but the entire system that had created and protected him. Preston reached for Grace's scarf with his free hand, and Grace let him. Because she knew something he didn't. Sometimes you have to let the monster reveal itself completely before you can destroy it. The first cut sliced through silk like it was tissue paper, rose-colored threads floating to the floor like blood drops. The second cut was deliberate, calculated to cause maximum psychological damage. Preston wasn't just destroying fabric, he was dismantling everything Grace represented. Everything that threatened his absolute power. But as he made the third cut, something unexpected happened. Grace smiled. Not a broken smile, not a defeated smile, but the smile of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment for 3 years. the smile of someone who'd set a trap and watched their prey walk directly into it. "Thank you, Preston," Grace said, her voice carrying across the stunned auditorium with crystal clarity. "I was hoping you'd do exactly that." Preston's knife hand faltered, confusion flickering across his perfect features. This wasn't how victims were supposed to respond. This wasn't the script he'd written in his head. "You see," Grace continued, turning to address the packed auditorium, "Preston just provided us with the perfect demonstration of what institutional enablement looks like. 500 witnesses just watched a student assault a teacher with a weapon, while administration sat silent." Dr. Cross finally found her voice, thin and desperate. "Now, Grace, let's not be dramatic." "Dramatic?" Grace's laugh cut through the auditorium like revelation. "Dr. Cross, would you like to explain to everyone here why Preston felt so confident he could attack me with impunity? Or should I?" The silence that followed was deafening, pregnant with secrets about to be born. Grace pulled out her phone, fingers steady as surgeons' tools, and projected her screen onto the auditorium's main display. The first image that appeared was Preston's knife slicing through silk, captured in high definition by Knox's hidden camera. Time-stamped and undeniable. "Knox!" Grace called out, her voice carrying absolute command. "I believe you have something to share." Knox Sterling stepped forward, his boyish face transformed by 3 years of accumulated rage. From his blazer pocket, he pulled out a device no bigger than a silver dollar, a recording device that had been documenting Preston's crimes for 8 months. "Everything," Knox said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I recorded everything." What followed was a systematic destruction of Preston Blackwood that was more thorough than any physical assault could have been. Audio recordings of Preston planning attacks on scholarship students, laughing about teaching the poor kids their place, discussing how to use his father's money to make problems disappear. Video footage of him planting drugs in other students' lockers, sabotaging college applications, orchestrating the social media campaign that had driven 3 different students to transfer schools. But the recording that shattered everything was Preston's own voice, captured just 2 weeks earlier, talking to his father about Grace Hamilton. "She needs to be broken, Dad, completely and publicly, like Mom should have been broken before she became a problem." The auditorium erupted, parents shouting, students crying, faculty members finally finding their voices in collective outrage. But Grace wasn't finished. The next image on the screen was a document marked "Confidential, Monica Blackwood's suicide note." The real one, not the sanitized version the school had hidden for 12 years. Preston's mother didn't die in an accident. Grace's voice cut through the chaos like divine judgment. She died by suicide after years of her son's escalating violence and her husband's threats to have her committed if she sought help. The school covered it up to protect their largest donor. Richard Blackwood, Preston's father, rose from his seat in the parent section, his face purple with rage and panic. "This is defamation lies. I'll sue this school into bankruptcy." "With what evidence?" Grace asked, her voice now carrying the authority of absolute truth. "Because I have security footage of your meeting with Dr. Cross, where you threatened to withdraw funding if the truth about your wife's death ever surfaced. I have financial records showing the payments you've made to silence victims. I have testimony from 12 different students your son has destroyed." Preston stood frozen at the front of the auditorium, his perfect mask finally slipping to reveal the hollow sociopath beneath. The knife hung limply in his hand, forgotten weapon in a war that was already lost. You want to know about legacy. Preston. Grace stepped closer, her voice dropping to intimate level that somehow carried to every corner of the space. Your legacy is written in the tears of every student you've broken, every teacher you've silenced, every institution you've corrupted with your family's blood money. She reached down and picked up the scattered pieces of her grandmother's scarf, rose-colored silk that had survived Nazis but fallen to teenage cruelty. This scarf represents 90 years of women who refused to stay silent in the face of evil. My grandmother documented genocide when the world preferred blindness. My mother fought workplace harassment when careers were destroyed for speaking up. And today, I'm documenting institutional corruption that has protected monsters like you for generations. Grace turned to face the auditorium, holding the destroyed scarf above her head like a battle flag. Every person in this room has a choice, right now, in this moment. You can continue enabling systems that protect predators, or you can choose courage. You can choose truth. You can choose to ensure that no other student ever suffers what Autumn Reeves suffered, what Sawyer Mills suffered, what Knox Sterling's sister Emma suffered. The transformation that followed was like watching a dam break. 3 years of accumulated silence exploding into collective action. Students stood first. Scholarship kids who'd been invisible. Legacy students who'd been complicit. Teachers' children who'd witnessed their parents' compromises. They stood and began speaking, sharing stories that had been buried under threats and money and institutional convenience. Autumn Reeves, her voice shaking but clear, described the systematic campaign that had driven her to attempt suicide. Sawyer Mills detailed the planted plagiarism that had almost destroyed his college prospects. One by one, victims found their voices, supported by the evidence Knox had been secretly gathering, protected by the media attention Grace had orchestrated. Faculty members began standing, teachers who'd been silenced by fear and intimidation, adding their testimonies to the growing flood of truth. Even some parents joined, mothers and fathers who'd suspected but been too frightened to act. Dr. Cross tried to restore order, her voice desperate and futile against the tide of revelation. But it was too late. The institutional silence that had protected Preston for 17 years was crumbling in real time. The local police, alerted by Grace's network, arrived within 20 minutes. Preston Blackwood was arrested on charges of assault with a weapon, his father on charges of witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. Dr. Cross was escorted out in handcuffs, charged with conspiracy to cover up a crime. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests. It was in the faces of students who'd found their voices, teachers who'd rediscovered their courage, parents who'd chosen truth over convenience. 6 months later, Grace Hamilton stood in the same auditorium, now renamed the Monica Blackwood Memorial Hall, addressing a very different gathering. The All Souls Assembly had become the annual Truth and Reconciliation gathering, where the Elmwood community confronted its past and committed to a different future. Preston was serving 18 months in juvenile detention, his father's business empire under federal investigation, their family name removed from every building and scholarship at the school. More importantly, Preston was in intensive therapy, beginning the long process of understanding how trauma and privilege had created a monster. Knox Sterling had become student body president, his courage inspiring a new generation of student advocates. His sister Emma had returned to school, not to Elmwood, but to a therapeutic environment where she was healing and thriving. Autumn Reeves now led workshops on digital citizenship and consent, her experience transformed into wisdom that protected other students. Sawyer Mills had received a full scholarship to Harvard, his grades and character recommendations strong enough to overcome any past sabotage. Dr. Cross had been replaced by Dr. Sarah Kim, the trauma psychologist who understood that true education required emotional safety as much as academic excellence. The new administration had implemented transparency measures, victim advocacy programs, and most importantly, a culture where institutional loyalty never trumped individual justice. But the most significant change was in Grace herself. She wore a new scarf now, one that had been gifted to her by an anonymous donor who turned out to be Monica Blackwood's mother, Preston's grandmother, a woman who'd been estranged from her son's family for years because she'd tried to get help for her daughter-in-law. This scarf was midnight blue, strong and beautiful and unashamed of its history. 6 months ago, Grace told the assembled community, a young man tried to destroy something precious, believing that destruction was power, that silence was strength, that money could bury truth forever. She touched the blue scarf at her throat, silk that represented not just survival, but transformation. He was wrong about everything, except one thing. That moment did change everything, just not in the way he intended. It taught us that institutional change happens when individual courage meets collective action. It showed us that silence protects predators, but truth protects everyone else. In the audience, she could see faces that had been transformed by the events of that October morning. Students who'd learned they had voices, teachers who'd rediscovered their purpose, parents who'd chosen difficulty over complicity. The scarf Preston destroyed represented 90 years of women's courage. Grace continued, "This scarf represents our commitment to the next 90 years, to building institutions that protect the vulnerable instead of the powerful, to choosing truth over convenience, to remembering that education isn't just about preparing students for careers, it's about preparing them for citizenship in a democracy that requires courage." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the auditorium. Every person watching this has a story. Maybe you've been the victim, finding strength in silence that should have been found in support. Maybe you've been the bystander, learning that neutrality in the face of oppression is always complicity. Maybe you've even been the perpetrator, discovering that harm to others ultimately harms yourself. Grace's voice carried the authority of someone who'd walked through fire and emerged transformed. Whatever your story, remember this: it's never too late to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, justice over institutional loyalty. Your voice matters, your experience matters, and someone needs to hear exactly what you've learned. She looked directly into the cameras recording the event, knowing her words would reach far beyond Elmwood's walls. The revolution started with one teacher, one scarf, and one moment of institutional cruelty that finally went too far. But it grew because ordinary people made extraordinary choices to speak truth, to demand better, to refuse to let evil hide behind nice manners and nicer buildings. Grace smiled, not the broken smile of a victim, but the fierce smile of someone who'd turned trauma into transformation. Some fights choose you, and when they do, you have two options: surrender to systems that prioritize power over people, or stand up and demand that those systems serve justice instead. She held up her phone, showing the contact information for the Elmwood Truth and Reconciliation Project. If this story resonates with you, if you've experienced institutional betrayal or seen others suffer in silence, if you believe education should be about building character instead of protecting privilege, then add your voice to this conversation. Not for likes or shares, but because democracy requires citizens brave enough to speak truth to power. The applause that followed wasn't polite or perfunctory. It was the sound of a community that had chosen healing over hiding, growth over comfort, truth over institutional convenience. Later that evening, Grace sat in her apartment, no longer the cramped space of a struggling teacher, but a home befitting someone who'd become a national voice for educational justice. The midnight blue scarf lay across her dining table, not as a battle map this time, but as a reminder of victories won and changes still to come, too. Her phone buzzed with a message from Knox Sterling, now a freshman at Georgetown. Studying journalism and documentary filmmaking, saw the assembly online. Emma says thank you for everything. The ripples keep spreading. Grace smiled, thinking about all the other Preston Blackwoods in all the other Elmwood academies, the institutional cultures that protected them, the victims who suffered in silence. But she also thought about all the Grace Hamiltons waiting to be awakened, all the Knox Sterlings ready to find their courage, all the communities prepared to choose truth over comfort. She touched the blue scarf, silk that had survived destruction to become something stronger. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more systems to challenge, more victims to empower. But tonight, she could rest in the knowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, one person's refusal to stay silent could change everything. Outside her window, Maple Ridge slept peacefully, a community transformed by the recognition that true strength comes not from power over others, but from the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And in schools across the country, other teachers touched their own scarves. Other students found their voices. Other institutions began the difficult work of choosing justice over convenience. The revolution wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because some lessons, once learned, can never be unlearned, and some courage, once awakened, never goes back to sleep.